Without further ado, welcome, Steve, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom, and it's a great honor to be here at NAIOP. What I'm going to do today is do two things. One is give perspective on the elections and the economy, but also make the case that after a time of turbulence, your industry and all its various parts of it are going to experience in the 2020s a great boom. Two big things are shaping up that is going to have profoundly positive impacts. So even though right now things look to be kind of dicey, people are wondering whether what kind of future we're going to have. But I think you can start to see real trends that are going to be very, very positive. We're all familiar with the roaring 1920s. What people forget is that decade began horrifically. They had a pandemic back then, as we know, the Spanish influenza, which took 8 times as many people, cost 8 times as many lives, proportion to population, as this pandemic has done in recent months. We had a terrible inflation, then an even more terrible depression, where unemployment reached higher levels than it did during this pandemic. But when things finally settled down, even though there are enormous changes, the decade was one of the most innovative in human history. So in terms of the economy, even though the economy has taken a real hit since March, the amazing thing is how resilient it has been and how quickly it has come back as states have opened up. You will notice a real dichotomy difference between states that have been opening up very aggressively, like Florida, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, and others, and those that, for a variety of reasons, have been much slower, like New York, my home state of New Jersey, Illinois, and other states. So you do get a tale of two states, tale of two cities by Dickens. We're getting a tale of two states here. But the economy overall still is showing real strength. You saw it in the jobs report that came out last week, which people thought, well, was slightly disappointing when they looked at the initial number. But when you got into it, it was actually very strong. Government jobs in September went down by 200,000. The reason for that was schools were for August, schools were very slow in opening up because of uncertainties about what the rules should be, whether you should have in-classroom instruction and the like. So that accounted for temporarily 200,000 jobs, mostly teaching jobs, that were temporarily eliminated. On the private sector part, though, the number of jobs created was 880,000, really above expectations. And you see other signs, purchasing managers, both in the service and manufacturing sectors, good numbers. Auto sales came out for September, very strong. Home sales, pretty good. So the resiliency of the economy is there. And the third quarter GDP number will come in probably around 34-35%. Quite a sharp contrast. You couldn't have a more sharper contrast than what happened in the second quarter. The fourth quarter will see a bit of a slowdown. I don't mean in terms of going backwards, but in the pace of recovery, because it's going to be a natural reaction to the uncertainty. What kind of environment, economic environment, are we going to have next year? Is it going to be a benign one, a hostile one, or something in between? And that gets to the election. If I were you, I would take the polls with a grain of salt, not because they're dishonest, but because the situation's so utterly fluid. And you've seen that just in the news. Are we going to get a stimulus bill or not? The president gets COVID. He says he's not going to, he's cutting off stimulus bill negotiations. And so you had a terrible debate. So you have this great fluidity out there. And so in terms of betting on the election, I would not bet more than one Zimbabwe dollar on the outcome. The Zimbabwe US dollar Zimbabwe dollar rate is about 10 billion to 1, so less than a penny. And but in terms of the outcome of the election, it's going to have a profound impact temporarily on the economy next year. Are we going to be in for higher taxes, especially the capital gains tax and business taxes? Are we going to have another round of burdensome regulation, which I'm going to touch on in a moment? If we do, I think that is going to be temporary. And after the elections of 2022, I think you're going to see a sharp rollback. We've already seen in the manufacturing sector what a little bit of deregulation has done to revive that battered sector of the economy. I mean, battered in terms of what's happened since the early 2000s until about 2015, 2016. And so the election is going to have enormous impact. What's going to happen to the Senate? What's going to happen in the White House? And so obviously we have a big debate tonight. People know this debate is particularly important with vice presidential debate because both candidates for the presidency are old. The president, as we mentioned, came down with COVID. He's 74. The Democrat candidate, former Vice President Joe Biden, is 78. And so there's a very real probability that the vice president, whoever takes the oath of office as vice president in January, could very well be in the Oval Office before the end of that term. So in terms of the economy, much will depend on the election. Also, the Federal Reserve, how much are they going to do in terms of printing money? I'll get to that in a few minutes, whether they're going to get it right or get it wrong. So in terms of predicting the outcome of the election, we'll get to that in the Q&A, but they're not worth even the air to breathe to make those projections because of how who's going to turn out to vote, uncertainty about what some of the balloting in terms of mail-in ballots. There are already scare stories on that one, some with real validity. So short term, things are going to take a little bit of a pause in terms of momentum because people don't know what the rules of the game are going to be. But in terms of now, when we do get a vaccine, and it'll be a series of vaccines, and they will be prevalent by next spring, obviously we're not going to go back entirely to the pre-status quo of March of 2020 when this thing hit us, when the pandemic formally knocked down and shut down the economy. We already saw enormous trends there, especially most graphically with retail. Parts of retail were doing very well even before the pandemic. Other retailers went down for the count. But we should keep in mind some of the projections that were made after 9/11, when a lot of people said no one's going to want to be in a tall building again. So if you have an office building more than 2 floors, forget about it. Well, that changed. So we're not going to go back to the pre-status quo. But let me touch on 2 big things that I think are going to make a boom for the whole commercial real estate area, most facets of it. One is we are going to see, especially with the big changes coming in healthcare, you're going to see more specific purpose offices, not just open space, but geared to biotechnology, biosciences, and the like in healthcare. But you're also going to see another thing happen, and that is a renaissance of small business formations. And once they get out of the home, they're going to want space. May not be a lot of space, but they are going to want space, more than I think people realize now. So let's start with one of the things that's going to bring about this renaissance. One is energy. Imagine if you had little or no energy costs, how much better that would be in terms of what the numbers you put on leases or rents. We all know natural gas is very cheap thanks to the fracking revolution, which nobody 20 years ago foresaw. We're going to run out of oil, run out of natural gas. Those predictions always should be taken with a huge grain of salt. But the use of energy is going to soar because it's going to become cheaper and cheaper. And it's not just natural gas. 2 things on the horizon that are going to change, I think, in the next decade or so, the cost of energy. One is nuclear. Now, you say nuclear, people say, oh, no, that can't be. And you're right. Not with what I'm talking about is not the technology, the reactors and the technology we have today. There's another kind of nuclear technology that is now beginning to be really developed. It's called molten salt. And the nice thing about molten salt nuclear power is they don't have spent fuel rods. As a matter of fact, they absorb them. They are safer and they're more easily to scale down. So you can have a small equivalent of a nuclear facility. This isn't just pie in the sky. Back in the 1950s, some of you may know from your history, the U.S. Navy went for nuclear power for its submarines and for its aircraft carriers. But it was based on the kind of technology we are using today. By contrast, the Air Force at the time that the Navy was developing nuclear-powered submarines and the like, the Air Force was developing nuclear-powered aircraft based on not the reactor technology we have today or that the Navy uses, but the molten salt technology. That experimentation development came to an end when the Air Force decided instead to go all out on missiles. So they didn't have to worry about how long an aircraft could stay in the air as much as they did before. So the research in molten salt nuclear technology kind of went in abeyance. Well, that is beginning to change today. And what you're starting to see is that people are recognizing that this molten salt technology avoids the real scare stuff of the traditional nuclear technology. It can ultimately become far cheaper and far more versatile. And the country where this is being, where this is really, this kind of a ferment, this kind of research and development is really flourishing. No one would guess the country. It is our friends to the north, Canada. Yes, Canada is the forefront of this new nuclear technology. And what you see happening is something what the regulators did in Canada. All except for Canada, nuclear regulation has been very, very heavy-handed. If you wanted to use a different brand of a screwdriver, you had to go through regulatory permission. So in terms of innovation, in terms of nuclear tech, it stagnated. It just didn't happen. The Canadians, by contrast, recently have taken a different approach, what you might call principles-based regulation, principle-based regulation. What that means is they define what the goals are in terms of safety and output, and you, the manufacturers, figure out how to do it on your own. And what this means is it opens up the field to innovation. So people can pursue different avenues without spending years getting permission to try something new. They can go ahead. So Canada, which nobody really realizes, is at the forefront of this new or really old new molten salt nuclear technology. Now, the good news is that the U.S. regulators have also started to take note, or nuclear regulators have started to take note what is happening in Canada, and they're starting to think maybe we should change that. In terms of the old way of this minute, heavy-handed regulation that has been the tradition, is not only did that prevent innovation, but it also kept old reactors online longer than they should have. We all know what happened in Japan several years ago with that tsunami and the disastrous thing that happened to the nuclear reactors they had there. Those nuclear power plants would normally have been retired years ago, but because there was no innovation coming along, they were kept in commission far longer than they would have been otherwise. So in terms of the nuclear power front, big things are happening in Canada. A lot of people are going up there who have ideas on it. I think we're going to start to see some of that ferment here. Another thing that's happening, which sounds really science fiction, and the idea's been around forever, is fusion power, based on essentially water. Now, that has been a great source of science fiction writings and everything for decades. And there's been a lot of disappointment in the progress of fusion in the past. They say about fusion what they say about Brazil. Fusion has a great future and always will. But what is happening in fusion now is it looks like there are some major league breakthroughs coming out there. And what that means is you could have within 10, 15, 18 years, literally, where you'll be able to get power literally from water, just vastly cheapening. You think you take the price of a power chip today for a computer and what it cost 20 years ago and what the similar kind of output is today. Moore's law doubles in efficiency every 18 months. You're going to get that kind of microchip advances. You're going to start to see that in the next generation or so in terms of energy, which will profoundly have an impact, positive impact on space and in terms of here, commercial space, and also in terms of economic output and efficiency. At the same time, we're going to see a revolution in energy. We're also going to see a renaissance in business startups. We've been in a drought for business startups for a number of years. By startups, I mean an entity that starts up and actually hires someone or two or three people within the next 12 months, not just paper startups, but people starting real businesses. This used to be a great source of strength in the United States, vibrancy to the economy, the number of startups we had, which is one reason why every generation we did what no other economy in the world could do, and that is create 50 to 75 new large companies. Obviously, big companies start as small companies. You look at Google 20 years ago versus what it is today, just a magnitude beyond comprehension. And so this ability to create new companies gave a vitality and an innovative spirit to the U.S. that you did not see in Europe or indeed in Asia. Now that started to go down very, very dramatically. In the 1980s, 1990s, we'd have about 800,000 real startups, new businesses each year. Because of a couple of bad things that happened, that went down to 500,000. Even as the U.S. population expanded, even as the U.S. economy continued to grow, the future was not looking good because of this drought in business startups, from 800,000 a year to 500,000. When you adjust for population GDP, it was even much worse. There were two, but in recent years, the startups started to revive again until COVID hit. And one of the amazing things, and this is why demographics are going to help us, is one of the biggest source of business startups proportionately of any group, of any ethnic group in the United States, is the Latino community. Their startups are about 3 times as much as any other group. And people don't realize it. So there's been a real story there. The other thing that was starting to happen before COVID was, for the first time in decades, you started to see a real pickup in business starts by African Americans in the United States. Obviously, COVID really has hit that very hard, smashed that, because new businesses are all, by definition, fragile. COVID was very hurtful on that. But if we get the right environment, those trends will renew itself. So why did we have the slowdown in business startups over the years? One is regulations. As you know, smaller entities have a harder time coping with massive regulations than the larger ones do. And you've got federal regulation like Sarbanes-Oxley, and then on the banking side, Dodd-Frank. The reason why the banking side was hurtful is that for startups, amazingly, small banks, community banks, until a massive wave of regulation started to come years ago, were the biggest source of money, other than people taking out mortgages on their houses. The biggest source of startup capital in the U.S., far, far outpaced anything you got from the venture capital industry. But because of regulation, that traditional source of startup money really took a real hit, where if you made a loan to a new business, the regulators would be all over you, asking you to give the paperwork 6 times, 6 ways to Sunday, which really had an inhibiting effect. So in terms of the disaster on manufacturing, my favorite story is to take an orchard in upstate New York, which the New York Times wrote about. It was an apple orchard. They have a lot of them in upstate New York. This particular apple orchard and the other orchards in the area are subject to 5,000 different rules and regulations, 5,000 from 17 different programs and agencies. One of the more idiotic rules is that when you pick apples off the tree and put them in a cart to take them to the shed for washing and processing, you have to cover the cart with a tarp. Why do you have to cover the tarp? Because the regulators say between the journey between the tree and the shed, bird droppings might get on the apples. Now think of it. The apples have been on the trees open for 5 months. And when they get to the shed, they're washed anyway. Yet they have to spend time and money on these kind of idiot regulations. You saw it too in terms of getting any infrastructure done. A bridge or even a road extension normally would take 2 years, now it takes 10 years. You saw it in manufacturing, particularly between 2006 and 2016, where literally, for undiscernible reasons, it wasn't as if you had some great plague in manufacturing, but they were suddenly subject to tens of thousands of new rules and regulations. A typical manufacturer, obviously they're all different kinds, so I'm just using general numbers here, would pay about $5,000 per worker in terms of taxes that they owed on that worker. The regulatory cost of that worker, taxes $5,000 or so, regulation $20,000 to $50,000. So when you have the hit on smaller banks, when you have more regulation, especially in the area of permitting, you contrast, for example, getting a permit to do a development, say, in Texas with California. If you do it in California, say you're age 30 and you want to do a project, maybe it'll be approved by the time your grandchildren are finished college, in contrast to what you see in Texas and Florida and elsewhere. So In terms of regulation, Mercatus, a research firm, found that with all if the regulations we had in the 1980s had proportionally stayed the same, not go down, but just stayed the same, the U.S. economy today, pre-COVID, would have been 25% bigger. Huge, huge costs. So what is going to happen here? What you're starting to see happen is not just the Trump administration's focus on deregulation, which is very real and very substantive, but also you're starting to see discussion of what you're seeing taking place in Canada on the nuclear energy side, and that is principle-based regulations. Don't have these minute 1,000-page books on what you can and cannot do. Heck, talk about regulation, a teacher can't even hug a student now without getting in trouble. No common sense, as people have pointed out, no common sense at all. But what you're starting to see is a movement towards principles-based regulation, where you put the goals out there and say, it's up to you to get it done. And if you don't, you will be held accountable for it, and appropriate penalties or punishments will be meted out. Give you one example. Several years ago, in Australia, they had hundreds of pages of regulations concerning nursing homes. And then they got the idea, throw out all those regulations and just have a few principles. 31 principles they came up with, 3 pages, 31 principles, like keep the place clean. And a lot of people thought, oh, without precise regulation, that's going to be a disaster. It turned out to be the opposite. They had better outcomes with the nursing homes with those principles and holding people accountable for those principles. So you couldn't say, well, we obeyed the rules, therefore we can't be responsible for bad things happening. No, if something bad happens, you are held responsible. So I think you're going to see a real move in this coming decade on principles-based regulation, which will be more efficient and really more effective in achieving desired goals of safety and productivity. Another big thing that I think is going to be more attention is going to be focused on, especially after the turbulence of perhaps the next couple of years, is the tax side. So in terms of your industry, what's happening in energy, what's happening in what's going to be a boom in small businesses, you're also, I think, going to see a movement in terms of tax simplification. One of the things, and you're beginning to get a little flavor of it in this stimulus debate, especially suspending payroll taxes for a period of time. But the thing to keep in mind, and you see it in the more and more contrast between red states and blue states, is that taxes just don't raise revenue for government. Taxes are also a price and a burden. The tax you pay on income is the price you pay for working. Tax on profit, the price you pay for taking risks that will work out. And tax on the capital gains, also risks that work out. So if you want more good things like productive work, risk-taking, and success, you lower the price on those good things, and you end up getting more. So in terms of the tax side, even if we get a massive round of tax increases next year after the elections, I think that is going to be temporary, and you're going to see the opposite take place. My favorite thing in terms of stimulus is the flat tax. 30 countries have done it. Let me quickly give some overview of the flat tax. It's a single rate. You throw out the current federal income tax code, which if you take the words of the code and all the attendant rules and regulations is 10 million words and rising, throw the whole thing out and simply replace it with a single rate. This is on the personal side, single rate with generous exemptions for adults and for children. A family of 4, for example, would pay no federal income tax on their first $52,800 of income. There'd be no tax on their savings. On the business side, you'd have instant write-offs, which would be very good for a lot of you listening here today. Instant write-offs, low rate. On the personal side, the highest rate would be a single rate. So after that $52,800, you'd pay only 17 cents on the dollar. The corporate rate would be only 17 cents on the dollar after you deducted the costs of doing business. And as I mentioned, 30 countries have done it with real success. What that does is the IRS tells us that we spend 6 billion hours a year filling out tax forms. We spend, experts estimate, over $300 billion a year here in the United States complying with this monstrous code that nobody understands. One quick story on that. Several years ago, a magazine took a hypothetical family's numbers, finances, gave them the 46 tax preparers people consider the best in the field, and asked them to fill out that family's tax return. And you know what they got back? 46 different returns, 46 different estimates of what that family owed. This from people who make their living at the thing. So I think you're going to see a real push. Short term, I think you'll see a real push for cutting income tax rates or suspending them, along with the payroll tax and some new stimulus bill, especially if the GOP wins the November election. But I think you're going to see profound movement for change after some couple of years of turbulence in the 2020s. This again gets to another reason why I'm optimistic about the future, is something that looks like a disaster today, and that is the cost of health care. Why is it that the price of health care just seem to go up and up and up with no end in sight? People today are paying more out of pocket because of high deductible plans that companies are adopting than ever before. And so cutting to the chase, the real reason why we have these rising costs is not because of the evil of this industry, part of the industry, or that part of the industry, and greedy drug companies and the like. It's the way the whole industry has evolved. Nobody designed it, so no villains. What's the problem with healthcare is it's a third-party system. At a hospital, the real customer is not the patient. The real customer is the insurers, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, or big insurance companies, perhaps some large employers. And as a result, you don't get the kind of normal consumerism, productivity you'd get in a normal industry because of that separation between the provider and the consumer. For example, prices. If you go to a hospital and you ask the price for a procedure, you get a very strange look. They either assume you don't have insurance or you must be crazy. Why would you want to know the price? What's it to you? I'll just quickly relate one of my favorite stories. A fellow in New Hampshire had a heart condition, goes to the doctor. The doc recommends several tests, including what is called a nuclear stress test. The patient asks, what does the stress test cost? Doctor says, I have no idea. This guy, being an entrepreneur, actually goes out, puts a team together, gets prices from 25 different clinics and hospitals in the New England area. Really hard work to get the prices. And the prices range for a test that is done the same everywhere, range from $1,450 to over $7,300 for the same test. He goes back to the cardiologist. The cardiologist says, I have no idea this costs more than $1,400. True story. The doc gets up, does some calculations, and tells the patient, given your particular condition, there's less than a 2% chance this test is going to tell us anything useful, so let's just drop it. So what's going to happen in healthcare? I mentioned more and more employers now are doing high deductible plans. A plan for a family now averages $20,000 a year, which is one reason why cash salaries for people haven't gone up. It's all being absorbed by healthcare. What it means is people are, consumers are now becoming more and more conscious of the cost of healthcare. And what you're starting to see rise up, slowly at first, but I think it's going to cascade, is the rise of businesses online, like you do for Expedia or Priceline. If you want to get a ticket or go to a hotel or something, you're starting to see services tell you, what is the cost of an MRI at this hospital, that clinic, that hospital? And so you're going to start to see the rise of real consumerism. You're also going to start to see a move to have nationwide shopping for health insurance instead of state by state, which will allow more innovation and competition. And you're also going to see more transparency. The administration's already pushing pricing transparency. You're going to see more and more of that in the future. What it means is you're going to have more of a traditional healthcare industry, which is going to unleash a massive renaissance of innovation. And so you're no longer going to have the situation. To see where the patient lies today in the healthcare industry, all you have to do is realize the lousiest motel in America wouldn't dare put you in a room with another guest with a curtain in between with a sick guest, which they sometimes still routinely do at a hospital, put you in sharing a room with another sick patient. That kind of thing is going to go out the window. And so in terms of the future there, it looks good. Let me just close with saying something about the Federal Reserve and money creation. The Fed obviously has created a lot of money. There's been a real demand for cash, obviously because of the COVID crisis. But the danger is, will the Fed overdo it? That's why you saw a rise in the price of gold in the last 12, 15 months by 50%. That's a warning sign that the Fed may be overdoing it. Now, depending on economic conditions next year, The Fed may be tempted to overprint money, which is going to lead to inflation of the kind we haven't seen since the 1970s when we had inflation and a stagnant economy. And the Fed will see if the Fed knows what to do. There are ways to deal with that in a very constructive way without damaging the economy. But that's going to be a big question mark. The dollar, and is the Fed going to overdo it next year? So bottom line, short term, elections going to be very important in the environment we have next year. Short term, back to the next year or two, a lot of turbulence. But if you look at underlying trends, small business startups, energy, a new tax system, or big changes in the tax system, positive changes, the future is going to be very bright. So bottom line, in the meantime, hang on. Better days are ahead.
Well, thank you, Steve, and good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Salvatelli, NAIOP's Executive Vice President and COO. I'll be leading our Q&A session this morning with Steve Forbes as he's generously offered to donate some of his time to answer your questions for this forum's exclusive. Please continue to enter your questions into the chat box. We'll do our best to get all of them on air as best we can. Steve, let me give you the first question that came out. Do you think that more stimulus is needed? And if so, are you concerned about the increase in the levels of national debt?
Well, I think not to be cute, but you have to ask what kind of stimulus. There's good stimulus and there's one that's going to do a lot of harm. For example, simply sending out, bailing out states like New York and my home state of New Jersey for bad fiscal practices of the past, no. That's going to end up doing more harm than good. Good stimulus would be, for example, suspending the payroll tax, which the president wants to do for 6 months or 9 months. So you don't, neither individuals nor businesses are going to be liable for that. We did a little bit of that in 2011, 2012, when the first 2 points of the payroll tax with bipartisan support were suspended for 2 years to help the economy. Doing that would have not only help people, give people a big pay raise, but also lower the cost of labor for businesses, lower the cost of hiring new people. Another thing they should consider, which there was a piece in the Journal today, Wall Street Journal, by my friend Steve Moore, is perhaps suspend the income tax for several months, which would also provide positive stimulus, lowering the cost of work, lowering the cost of labor, and enabling people to keep more of what they earn. There's a lot of talk about writing a new round of checks for individuals. Even though that's just a one shot and doesn't do lasting good, I would be in favor of that. In fact, I would go above the $1,200 per individual and $500 per dependent that they're talking about and go even higher, say $2,000 per individual and $1,000 per dependent, and make it a one shot. That's better than raising the payout each week if you're unemployed, which can have distortive impacts on the labor market. This is a one shot, does not distort the labor market in any way, but gives people some substance to help put their finances in order. The airlines do need a lifeline, or they're also going to be hundreds, tens of thousands of layoffs there unnecessarily. That industry will eventually come back, as will the entertainment industry, as we begin to realize that we can live with this virus because we have treatments and we also have vaccines. So I hope they put together a good stimulus bill and not junk it up as they did in a couple of the previous bills.
It's a lot of hope you're placing on them there. Another question that came in for us, what do you believe are the consequences to continued inaction on Social Security on our aging population?
I think in terms of, and by the way, let me just quickly hit the previous question on the national debt. The key thing on the national debt is not just the size, but whether we have the economic policies in place to enable us to grow us out of our problems. We all know the asset side is growing and the liability side is stabilized. That's good for the future. It's what we did after World War II, where we had even a higher national debt because we fought a war to save civilization than we do today proportionately. But for the next quarter century or so, we actually did things more right than wrong. And the national debt as a proportion of GDP went from over 120, 25% down to about 35%. In terms of Social Security, I think there are two approaches. One is what you might call root canal without anesthesia approach, and the other is a more positive pro-growth approach. The root canal approach would say raise the retirement age to 85. I exaggerate, but they're going to come up with ideas of raising the retirement age even more, of reducing benefits if they think you have assets above a certain level or income above a certain level. That's not the way to do it. Fortunately, which is not fully grasped, is the American economy has the wealth, has the resources to meet its current commitments to Social Security beneficiaries. Those are on Social Security. Those are about to go on Social Security in the next 10, 15, 20 years. The real problem was the younger people. And with younger people, we should be putting in a new system today where a portion of their payroll tax goes to their own personal retirement accounts with real restrictions on terms of where the money goes and things like that. But so for first-time, part-time job, you're going to start be setting aside money in a thing that people are going to wonder, what's this thing they call capital? And people are going to recognize, young people, that this system, that money is from their own work, their own labor, produce that money in those accounts. And the nice thing about those accounts is it turns what is now a capital destroyer, the way the system is designed, to a capital creator as you put money in over your working life. And even if you're just minimum wage, you'll end up in retirement having as much or more. This is amazing what compounding does over a few decades, more than what the current system is paying beneficiaries, most beneficiaries today. The nice thing about that is you choose when you want to retire. So if you want to retire at 60 or at least partially retire, you can do it, your choice. If you want to wait till you're 95, you're an optimist, go right ahead. And the nice thing, too, is you can pass these resources, these assets on to your heirs, whether it's kids, grandkids, your favorite cat, or whatever. So positive approach, I think we can afford to do the positive approach, but I fear they may try the negative approach and undermine the whole basis of Social Security, which was trust. You put the money in, you get the benefits out.
Well, thanks again, Steve. We got a question now that's asking you to look into your crystal ball and to give us your outlook for the municipal bond market.
The municipal bond market, which goes through its own life cycles, the long-term future is going to be pretty good. Even if we have a flat tax, the tax exemption of the bonds won't change. That's a constitutional question. And so they'll always have a little bit of an advantage. What you'll see, though, is that in the future, I think there's going to be, because of the tax changes we'll be making, people are going to look more and more at the soundness of the asset behind that bond. So just to take a macro approach, they're going to look much more favorably, say, at GO, general obligation bonds from a state of Texas, than they will from a state like Illinois or New York or New Jersey. You're starting to see a little bit of that already. They'll be looking at specific projects, like has this hospital really got its act together? And the data is there for it, but there's going to be even more data in the future. So yes, the market will be good. There are going to be some good ones and some not so good ones.
Well, thanks. As you might expect, taxes, of course, are still coming up as questions for you. And one of the questions that did come up is, what would be some of the short-term effects of an increase in capital gains taxes on the economy and on business activity?
Increasing the capital gains tax, which is a tax on savings, a tax on what they call capital creation, which is savings and profits, would hurt the economy. The economy is fueled ultimately by investment. And there's a new measure of the economy that is beginning to, you're going to hear more and more, it's a terrible sounding word called gross output, but the initials are good, GO, gross output, which measures, what people don't realize with GDP, Mark, is that GDP measures final sales. It does not measure B2B, does not measure much the supply chain activity. So it measures a big chunk of the activity that goes to create final sales in the economy. Very, very distortive. You got to look at both. And when you do that, you realize the fundamental importance of business investment. And the kind of tax proposals that are being bandied about, tax increase proposals, would hurt capital creation. The thing to remember is government creates resources. The private sector creates resources. Government can take them, and whether by seizing them or by the usual traditional way of taxation, but it does not create them. So when you move resources from the economy, by definition, it's probably not going to be as stewarded as well over time as resources that are in the hands of private investors, people who really have to get a return or they're going to pay a price for it. So we have the capital gains tax proposal that former Vice President Biden has proposed, which would take the level to 40% or more. We haven't seen those rates, Mark, since the 1970s. And none of you probably are old enough to remember the 1970s, but economically it was a miserable decade of high inflation, stagnation, and not much happening in terms of innovation. After we cut the capital gains tax in the late 1970s, that's when you started to see what we know as Silicon Valley. It was always there, but really rise up and flourish to become a worldwide force of huge proportions. So raising those taxes on businesses, raising the marginal tax rates, raising the capital gains tax, I think it's just going to have a deleterious impact on the economy. And if they do it, it ain't going to last long, because one thing about politicians is if they see the economy being hurt, that means they're less likely to get reelected. And so I think you would see a big change by 2022, if not before. But I hope they don't do it in the first place. Look at history.
Well, our next question actually changes focus a little bit, Steve, and looks at more the overall global environment. And the questionnaire asks, do you believe that we have withdrawn excessively on a global level?
The answer is, despite the rhetoric, the answer is so far still no. In terms of security, we're still very much involved with NATO. In Asia, countries there like Vietnam, who would have thought it, desperately want a strong U.S. presence there. They see it as a counter to China. Yes, most of their economy is going to be tied more to Chinese trade than U.S. trade, but they want us to make sure they don't become what you might be called vassals to China. They want us as a counterweight. In terms of supply chains, which the creation, which really got a huge boost, which is why we have these fantastic handhelds, the creation of containers, which is a marvelous story, what they call the box. It looks simple, but what it had to go through to become part of trade enabled massive supply chains at a cheap price because shipping costs dropped dramatically, upwards of 95%. So it's taken a little bit of a hit with the tariff. I'm not a tariff guy. I think the tariff is another word for sales tax. I think there are better ways of coping with trade abuses than putting taxes on ourselves, because that's ultimately what that tariff is. So I don't think we're going to withdraw from the world, but I think we're going to see the patterns change. But we need more people involved in the global economy, because that has economies of scale and opportunity. And it's taken a little bit of a hit, but I don't think it's going to be permanent.
Well, great, thanks. As you might imagine, our members have a great interest in the retail sector, obviously an important part of commercial real estate development. And our next question asks to get your thoughts on, is there a future for retail? What do you think?
Well, there's a future for retail because we love buying things. We love buying services. We love buying products. And everyone is focused on the explosion online, the delivery systems that Amazon has put in and others are putting in, like Walmart. But in terms of buying, yes. And what I think you're going to see in the future is, even though a lot of the big box stores are in trouble, we all know the names. We all know what's happened to some storied names like Brooks Brothers and others. I think you're going to see really more what you might call boutiquing retailing. Yes, we'll be buying stuff online, but we also like to go out and see things, be stimulated, feel things. And no matter how good it is on screen, we like to see and be stimulated by the real thing. It's like I like to buy books. I can find plenty of books and browse around on the internet, but there's nothing like going to a standalone bookstore and seeing the actual things and getting the mind stimulated. So retail is going to grow. Proportionally, it will grow faster online. But the idea that suddenly we're not going to have any more storefronts, no. You're also going to see restaurants come back. In New York City, for example, they've taken an unnecessary bad hit because of, I think, dumb rules on openings and the like. But you look at the proliferation of restaurants, even though we only eat a certain amount each day, maybe some of us too much, but we love more and variety. So, you used to have restaurants like Italian and Chinese and French, American, but now there's suddenly, because of affluence, you had what they call fusion, which is mixing it. You're going to see more and more of that. So storefronts, restaurant fronts are not going to go. The character will change, but not the need for seeing things with our own eyes and feeling them, whether it's on our mouths or with our fingers in a store or in a restaurant.
Steve, thanks for your insights on that. So we've got time for one more question. And, I saved the best for last, or at least the person who asked this certainly is saving the best for last. They want to know, any plans to host Saturday Night Live again anytime soon?
Well, I had great fun with that. That was back in 1996. And thankfully, it's proven to be very popular. So when they do reruns on it, I still each year get a little bit of the scale is so minuscule now you need a microscope. But I think last year the royalties for my appearance on that show 20 some odd years ago, last year I think came to $4.50 gross and about $2.08 net. So and it was great fun. My 5 daughters got to go on it. You wouldn't recognize them because of the disguises and the makeup, but they had a great time. But I did keep my day job, and thank goodness. I had one good thing on a stage. When I was in school, I never got to be in a school play where you had to do anything. So this was once in a lifetime. But I realized doing it, it worked. So quit while you're ahead before you really stumble.
Perfect advice to end the session. Well, Steve, I really want to thank you for sharing your insights today as part of this exclusive session to the members of our national forums. I'd like to remind everyone that next up, join us for our keynote address with veteran political strategist Donna Brazil, along with our presentation of the NAIOP Developer of the Year Award. The keynote is going to begin at 12:45 Eastern Time. Participating in the conference is a great way to extend your network. And this year, we're adding a little incentive. Throughout the event, the platform will award points for things like visiting a sponsor's exhibit booth, filling out your profile, and having meetings with another attendee. For all the forum members, we'll also be adding a $250 towards a future forums bar tab to the forum member with the highest point total. Other prizes include a $200 Amazon gift card, a set of Apple AirPods, a free NAIOP on-demand course, and free registration to our upcoming OfficeCast event. Check out the Play to Win tab in the platform to learn more. And we'd like to say thank you to our Play and Win sponsor, Rockefeller Group. Look forward to seeing you all throughout CRE Converge and enjoy the rest of this virtual conference. Thank you. We'll see you soon.